Okay, hello again. I'm continuing my journey into my own doping research. This time I'll talk about a paper published in European Journal of Sports Studies this year, 2017, with the title Fighting Doping Through Sport Redesign. I hope you like it. As always, we find the presentation on my academia side. Under conference presentations, I think. Yeah, let's go there. Yeah, there it is. Let's click it and download it and full screen it, and then we can start. The title is Fighting Doping Through Sport Redesign, and it's published in the European Journal of Sports Studies, or EJSS Journal, Sports Law and Economics, as they seem to still like calling themselves on their web page. I am Kjetil Haugen, and I am the sole author of this paper. It was published this year, 2017. Okay. The outline is split in 6 points. The first one is a quick definition of doping prevalence. Then I'll say a little bit about how doping works as of now, in a fairly simplified manner, of course, and I'll talk a little bit about traditional anti-doping work and 3 dimensions in that relation. Then the main point of the paper comes up at point 4, named a different angle of attack here. And the idea is already revealed, make the game more complex. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, and then I'll end by 2 example structures, one which kind of may be an example, the other, the final one, is related to something that can be changed. Okay. Doping prevalence varies between sports, it says here, and it's reference to work. This is of course not big news. It's to be expected, and it's also empirically relatively easy to argue for. The concept of doping prevalence is the share in an athlete population using performance-enhancing drugs. So you can think of a certain percent, say that in 100-meter running at the top level, maybe 10%, maybe 50%, maybe 100% uses pads, who knows? While we also might think that in football, the tendency to use these artificial stimulations is less. And what could that be? This relates to the sport itself and mainly its complexity. If a sport is very complex, then still we don't have that complex drugs. So most drugs we have, at least as of today, is kind of related to single dimensions. And if a sport then is very complicated, it's obviously much harder to get a reasonable effect from using drugs. Let's talk a little bit more about this topic. Largely, at least simplified, we can say that doping can have effects within 3 different dimensions. The first one is referred to as force speed here, and the answer typically is some kind of steroids. Okay, a steroid makes your muscles bigger, and of course that makes you run faster or throw longer and that kind of stuff. The other dimension, endurance, very often, of course, force speed versus endurance are conflicting dimensions. So if you have a strong endurance, you are not necessarily very strong. Okay, you don't have much muscles. The normal means in getting better endurance is height training, which of course is illegal, EPO, and blood doping, which is illegal. The third dimension here is related to the adrenaline level in your blood, and it may be that too high adrenaline may have problems in certain sports, for instance in shooting, and very often, at least in the old days, substances of the beta blocker type were used to achieve more calmness. So as it says here, sorry, if the sport needs a collective set of characteristics and the effect of PEDs either kill each other or even worse are conflicting, steroids produce aggression, for instance, not calmness, it is much harder to make PEDs work. So if you have a very complex sport that kind of relies on a multitude of dimensions of human characteristics, it is hopefully less likely that the temptation to use PEDs is realized. That is the main idea of this paper. Maybe we can do something with the sport itself. Normally, there are roughly 3 dimensions which are used to try to fight PED abuse in sports. There are 3 parameters here, R, C, and A. R is the probability of revealing dopers, C is the cost of being revealed, and A is the price involved in taking part in the contest. And normally we can try to manipulate the, if you like, the doping prevalence by changing values of R, C, and A. And if we increase R, or make the probability of revealing dopers higher, then we would expect less dopers. I kind of try to put these in contrast to the normal crime punishment perspective here to see the link. And if you're looking to take normal crime in the civil society, then of course increasing R means getting more and or better police. If you have more police, it's easier to solve crimes. If you have better police, it's obviously easier to solve crimes. And solving the crime here relates to revealing doping cheaters. Point 2 here is related to increasing the C, or make it more costly to be revealed. That could be done in sports by making these abolishment periods longer, or starting to take fines from the athletes and so on. You can even put them in jail, of course, if you like that. In the normal crime punishment perspective, this relates to or corresponds to harder and tougher sentences. Point 3, final one, which is kind of perhaps still not very normal, is to decrease A, to make the value of winning the competition smaller. If you do that, you would hope that the most aggressive athletes, who are perhaps have the highest tendency to use drugs, lose interest in it because it doesn't pay off as good as before. When it comes to the normal crime punishment perspective, this corresponds to remove the treasure, if you like, or the money or the bank or whatever, or hide it better. As you can see, there is some kind of a link between 1 and 3 here. Okay, this is the normal way of doing stuff. Okay, and according to a lot of researchers, especially in the area of economics of doping, we don't succeed. Okay, we are not able to get rid of the drug problem, even if WADA still is making their tests better and making their tests more, and we make moving from a 2-year to a 4-year ban. The last point 3 we haven't tested out yet, but I have some kind of belief in that one, but that's a different. The problem here with all these 3 dimensions is that they are in a sense costly. Okay? To increase R, we need to spend resources. It's not cheap. Increase C doesn't make it more costly. Especially if you take fines, of course, you make it less costly or actually more profitable. But there is another cost element here, and that's related to the supply curve. If you make it very costly to get revealed, of course, a lot of athletes may get reluctant to take part at all. Sometimes athletes who have not taken drugs are convicted for drug taking, and of course if the cost of revelation is extremely high, then it could be that the supply curve changes. And that could lead to less athletes, which could lead to less competition, less money into the system, and so on. Okay, maybe not that good idea. Of course, the same thing may happen when it comes to point 3 here. If you make it less valuable winning a competition, then of course again athletes is perhaps less interested in taking part, making the audience less interested, and so on. So you get this negative circle. The suggestion in this paper is launching a fourth dimension, the dimension of sport redesign. Change the game, or in a crime punishment perspective, change the laws. What's nice in sports, as it says here, is that root changes are under full internal control. Of course, in the civil social society around, thinking about changing the laws, the same holds, but democracy has perhaps a tendency to make it hard to get the right laws. As I say here, if certain sports are constructed or have rules such that the expected doping prevalence is high, why not change these sports? Change the rules in some way, typically maybe easiest to make them more complex. And if you achieve that goal, you should expect less doping abuse. The nice thing about this idea is, of course, that it's cheap. It may not have devastating effects on the supply side. The not so nice thing is that it needs high creativity. It's not that easy to change a given sport, say shot put, in a manner that makes it so complex that using steroids or something similar doesn't help you that much. I will try to come up with some creative suggestions later, but obviously it's not that easy to come up with. And of course, what we aim to do here is basically to maximize complexity, given some kind of constraint on making audience attraction unchanged, or maybe even higher. So we want to keep the sport's popularity, or we make it more popular, but at the same time complexify it such that the doping is less frequent. Of course, this is an even tougher task than just making a sport more complex. There's not much point in making shot put complex if people don't want to look at it anymore. Okay, then there is no shot put anymore, and that's not the point. Okay, let's look at a classical example. Cross-country skiing, as you may know, is a sport mainly performed in the Scandinavian countries with a few French and German and American athletes. It's about running on skis as fast as possible on flat ground, more or less. So it should not be confused with alpine skiing, which is something quite different. Cross-country skiing has historically seen a lot of pet use. Actually, the most famous Norwegian female cross-country skier, Kjetil Haugen, was caught last year and has been abolished for 2 years, missing the next Olympics in South Korea. So this is a sport where doping obviously had been very frequent all the way from the early 70s up until today. One answer to this could be to change the rules to make it more complex, and of course a seemingly jokeful answer could be biathlon. Of course, biathlon is there, and it has been there almost as long as cross-country skiing itself. And the idea by doing it was definitely not to make doping problems less, but it has this effect, doesn't it? If you take running as fast as you can on flat ground, or with at least a few hills to climb and a few hills to go downward, could be complex enough if you can't ski, of course, but all these guys and girls, they know how to ski, so in that sense it's not very complex. Of course, this new invention from the FIS, or the Federal Ski organization of mass starts makes it slightly more complex, but in a negative manner. We don't need to go into that. But biathlon is kind of a complexified version of cross-country skiing because you add shooting. Okay, shooting has a different ability. It needs different skills than endurance, which kind of is the main point in cross-country skiing. And luckily, of course, this mix doesn't really help because endurance and calmness, or to be more direct, the drugs used to improve endurance and calmness are not conflicting, as for instance calmness and steroids would be. So if you really want to change biathlon, my suggestion would be to reduce the distance. So instead of going 7.5, 10 and 20 kilometers as they do today, you should make this distance very much shorter. So if you run just a kilometer or two, making it a sprint, then of course the endurance doesn't matter that much, but the force speed dimension matters suddenly, and then you may be tempted to take steroids. On the other hand, if you take too much steroids, you get aggressive, you may get trembling and so on, and it gets hard to shoot. So then you kind of are in a situation you would like. Okay, you complexify the sport in a manner that kind of makes at least the drugs you have available so far hard to use. Of course, as it says here, and by the way, biathlon is not ped-free, although seemingly less problematic than cross-country skiing, kind of just stresses my point here that biathlon as we know it today doesn't really fulfill the task. We need to go a few steps further. But this is something you actually could do. You could say, okay, we don't walk long distances in biathlon, no, we just walk short distances. In that case, the combination makes it hard to utilize known drugs. Okay, let's look at a different example. Let's look at some classic track and field athletics events like shot put, javelin, discus, or hammer throw. You know, all these throwing exercises in the track and field area. The idea is simple: to throw something as far as possible. Either you throw a globe in shot put, you throw a javelin in javelin, you throw a discus in discus, or a hammer in hammer throw. Of course, there are geometrical differences on these objects, making the techniques different, but the idea is simple, it's the same. Throw as far as possible, and the guy or the girl who throws fastest wins. You're probably also aware of the fact that these events have had a lot of doping problems. It may also seem, of course, as today's results are kind of far behind the world records here, at least in some of these events, and maybe especially on the female side, that maybe doping isn't such a problem anymore. To be honest, I don't feel certain on that. Maybe the doping doesn't have the same direct good effects as steroids used to have in those days when you could use it. It could be that you take it in different amounts, in maybe more like micro doses or something. You still get effects, but you don't get the same effects. So I don't really buy that. The fact that you don't reach the world record is kind of some guarantee that there is no doping yet. We know, don't we, that in other track and field areas, like in 100 meter, 200 meter running, there is constantly doping cases. So why should all these throwing guys suddenly be so nice? Of course, they know that if they use too much steroids, they will be caught. So they don't do that in the same manner as before. Maybe they use something else. I don't know. So, how could we make a simple change in these throwing exercises to make them more complex? I suggest here just a simple one: adding an air target, say some kind of ring in the air. These would induce significant complexity, given that the rule change is as follows: any throw missing the target is not measured. So instead of having the classical way of not measuring, stepping out of the line or whatever you do, then you add something else now, something extra, a ring that you have to hit. So by adding this aiming dimension, you kind of introduce a new skill element, which perhaps does not go so good with steroids, because you actually have to be using the same kind of genes as a shooter would do. Okay, of course it will be a lot of dead throws. Of course, this will of course depend on the size of the target, but it kind of opens up in the same way that biathlon enhances cross-country skiing. Unfortunately, I don't know whether this will be interesting for the audience, whether they would prefer to sit and see if they can hit the ring. Of course, it may enhance the event. It may not. I don't know. You have to check it out, make some questionnaires, test it out, and see what happens. Okay. As it says in the end here, of course, all the track and field events like sprints are harder. We could, of course, blindfold the sprinters. It could be funny, but perhaps not sportly interesting. We could, of course, add hurdles, but that's already done, isn't it? But still, adding hurdles doesn't add the kind of correct complexity. Of course, when you enter the finishing line, you could be entering a quiz, but of course that would be something else, wouldn't it? And not really in the sense. So this one needs far more creativity than I have today. Okay, so to sum up, the idea is very simple. Change the rules makes the sport more complex. Think about at least these 3 dimensions. Try to have these 3 dimensions and perhaps also some intellectual dimensions, like you, for instance, have in football. Okay, it's not just about physical, but also mental stuff. Not only controlling your adrenaline, but also being able to think and reason. Okay, so that's kind of what you see in football, isn't it? You have to be strong, you have to have endurance, you have to control your adrenaline, not getting too nervous, especially if you take penalty kicks, but you also have to make intelligent decisions, don't you? You have to be able to calculate the trajectory of the ball, to be able to hit it on your head. You have to make decisions, speed on whether to dribble or pass. And if you pass, you have to decide on who to pass to and so on. There's a lot of intellectual activity going on in football players' heads. Of course, this does not mean that there is not intellectual activity going on in cross-country skiers or biathloners or throwers or whatever. Of course, there is intellectual activity going on, but the strategic and tactical elements are far, far easier, far less complex. And of course, when you take drugs, you always face the risk of creating mental instability in some ways. Okay, there's always co-effects of medicines, and very often they may affect your mental situation. And if you're able to combine sports in such a way that most of the traditional physical drugs, which you can use and which you expect or suspect that are used, have negative impacts on other characteristics that's needed to perform the sport, then you have kind of, at least temporarily until they kind of find out the ultimate drug, the genetic part, you have something that could reduce ped use real. Okay, thank you. That's all from me today.